Hello, in this lecture we are going to talk about some biomes that occur in the waterways on our planet. So we classified these as aquatic biomes. We're going to start with mentioning a case study that took a look at sunscreen and how this component of sunscreen called oxybenzone is a chemical compound that believes to have a significant effect on coral reefs. So in this study, scientists were testing in particular how this chemical impacted coral reef larvae, and they found that it tends to lead to coral bleaching. And so this could be a significant reason why coral reefs tend to suffer in particular parts of our planet. If you think about, people going swimming into the ocean, going scuba diving or snorkeling, coral reefs are great, beautiful structures that pull a lot of tourists and a lot of human activity. But it's this chemical that we carry into the water because we put on sunscreen that tends to harm it as well. So a lot of the sunscreens that have been made and produced in the United States often have this chemical compound. If you go to somewhere that has since banned the use of sunscreen with oxybenzone, you'll find that there are new coral reef safe sunscreens that are made without that compound. So Hawaii is an example of a place that has banned the use of sunscreens with oxybenzone in an attempt to preserve coral reefs. So aquatic biomes are determined by these characteristics listed on the bottom here. Salinity is a measurement of the saltiness of water. Another variable that contributes to the aquatic biome is the depth of the water. Turbidity, which is a measurement of the number of suspended particles in the water. Also the amount of nutrients in the water and the temperature of the water. So if you look at all the water on our planet, we see that most of it is saltwater, and we find most of that water in oceans, and only 2% approximately is freshwater. And out of all of that freshwater, the majority of it is locked up in ice. A good chunk is also locked up in groundwater, and then it's only about 1% that is found in rivers and lakes, and that's of the freshwater. So this is a very important resource we need to continue to protect and preserve because it's not only important to us as organisms, but all living organisms need access to a water source. So we're going to start with the freshwater biomes. So the first one is a stream, and this is a small, narrow river, and it is an example of freshwater. You can, if you have been running or hiking through Annandale or Howarth Park, you've probably hiked through a stream, not too hard to hop over. And this will carry fresh water to a larger body of water, like a lake or an ocean. Same with a river. A river's larger than a stream, but it also is this system that transports water to a larger body like the ocean or a lake. And rivers can carry silt. They can also carry toxic chemicals if those are in the runoff from somewhere near this body of water. Runoff would carry those toxins to the river, and then the river would carry them even further, unfortunately. On the next slide, let's take a look at some of the features of a river. So we see the start of the river is up here, so we call that the source, or where we find the headwater of the river. So fresh water is entering the river here. That's where the system begins. With gravity, the water falls down into the body of the river, maybe some rapids, and it transitions into smaller creeks and streams, which are these tributaries here. And then from there, it'll enter a larger river system and eventually into, in this case, we have like the ocean which has saltier water. So here we have fresh water transitioning into salt. And in the delta right here, the mouth of the river, we have mixing of the fresh and the salt water, which could produce brackish water, which we've talked about earlier. So know that the delta is where we find the mixing of the fresh and the salt water, and the mouth of the river is this portion right before the delta. It's kind of like the end of the river before it transitions to dump into that larger body. So if you think historically, rivers have come up in your history classes. A lot of civilizations are built around water, whether it's a coast or a river. So see if you can think of and name some of the largest rivers in the world, and add those to your notes. These large rivers carry what we think approximately about half of the runoff on our planet. So here on the map, you can see some of the major rivers lined and mapped out. Maybe you were able to get a couple of those. Our next freshwater biome we're going to talk about are ponds. And ponds are small. They could be natural or artificial ponds. And they occur in little small isolated depressions in the landscape. So they could be filled up with water year round, or maybe just a short amount of time. But they are pretty small in comparison to lakes. So lakes, although this is in the freshwater section of our presentation, there are some saltwater lakes as well. But lakes are large bodies of water, and they occur in, again, a depression, which has been made in Earth's surface, usually by plate tectonics. There are some man-made lakes, but more commonly we see natural lakes. Go ahead and make note of the largest lake by surface area, which is Lake Superior. It's one of the Great Lakes near Wisconsin and Ontario, Canada. The largest river by volume is found in Siberia, Russia. So Lake Baikal is this very large lake by volume, and it formed in a continental rift. So think back to plate tectonics. When plates are moving apart, they create this continental rift, which explains this lake's incredible depth, and basically water filled in and resulted in this lake. So if you look at the composition of a lake, we can break it into these zones. And it is shown on this diagram. We have the littoral zone, which is the shallowmost portion of the lake. This is where a lot of the activity occurs when we are going to a lake for recreation. And this is also where the warmest part of the water is, because it is so shallow. The other two zones we have here, we have the limnetic zone, which is the open portion of our lake, and then the profundal zone, which is the deepest portion of the lake. And in a lake, the temperature usually is the warmest at the top and then coolest at the bottom, and that's because we have sunlight penetrating at the top and goes down from there. While we're talking about lakes, it's important to know there are several different types of lakes, and we can classify them into these different categories as being either oligotrophic or eutrophic. So the oligotrophic lakes are those that we see very clear water. There's not a lot of nutrients. There's a lot of oxygen. And it just looks like a very pristine lake. So we see we see quite a high amount of diversity in these lakes. Alternatively, we see lakes that have been eutrophied. So we would call this a eutrophic lake. In this case, these are greener, so there's an abundance of nutrients. Maybe it is from runoff, where we're adding pollutants to waterways, which are then carried to this lake. But it's green because we have this excessive growth of algae, which in the long run ultimately results in less oxygen available in this environment. And as a result, we see a decrease in diversity of the organisms in these types of lakes. So one more thing you should be aware of regarding lakes is known as thermal stratification. And so a thermocline is shown in this diagram where we have a dramatic drop off of temperature that as we go deeper into a lake, we see that the temperature is warmest at the top, and then there's a dramatic transition to cooler waters. And this sometimes doesn't last year round. It tends to be abundant in lakes during summer months because that's when we have a lot of sunlight warming the top portion of the water. And then we might have a thermocline and a transition to much, much colder water below that in comparison. So now let's talk about some marine biomes. These are our saltwater biomes, and we're going to start in the ocean. So remember, there are 5 major oceans. The largest one is the Pacific, and the oceans have salinity that measures to be about 3.5%. So that means for every 1,000 milliliters, we have 35 grams of salt. And usually the salt is sodium chloride, but it's not always. So remember that sodium chloride is our main salt in the ocean, but there are other salts present as well. So let's talk about the zones that we can see in ocean, one of them being the intertidal zone, which you guys have probably seen before if you've gone to the beach. This is a place where the ocean and the land meet and they interact. And think about what happens on the shore of an ocean. We have tides that come and go. We have storms. We have waves that crash. So it's a pretty harsh environment if you think about it. There's a lot of disturbance and a lot of change throughout this zone. So organisms have these adaptations that allow them to withstand these dramatic changes in their environment. So whether they're being pounded by waves or changing temperatures, storms, or they have different access to sunlight throughout the day or months, they all have adaptations that help them survive these pretty dramatic conditions. Another saltwater biome is the mangrove forest. And these are biomes that are in tropical waters. They're very warm waters, and the roots, you can see, they come out of the water. They're also found in coastal and tidal zones, and unfortunately they are being destroyed. So we're doing a lot in mangroves as humans. So here's a quick list of some of the things we are doing as humans impacting this biome. We're growing rice. We do rice farms. We collect rubber trees. We establish palm oil plantations, shrimp aquaculture, and we urbanize this land as well. So all of these are contributing to the degradation of this biome. So hopefully we can reverse that in the future. So just like we talked about how lakes have different zones, the ocean does as well. You may have learned about these different zones throughout the ocean before, but it varies due to the availability of sunlight. So sunlight is most available in the top layer we have the sun shining down. So we have the warmest water up here and the coolest water down in the lower layers. Along with varying temperatures, we have varying amounts of nutrients. So the top layer is going to have the most nutrients, the most life. We have photosynthesis happening up here. We have less going on in the lower parts of the ocean. There are not as many nutrients available and not as many different forms of life. There are some pretty wild forms of life down there that are adapted to these cold temperatures and immense pressure down there because they're under all of that other water on top of them. But most of the life we observe in the ocean occurs in these top layers. So something to make note of is algae. Algae is a significant organism that plays a major role in many of these aquatic biomes. And this is a primary producer. It provides a lot of oxygen in these environments because it is able to photosynthesize. And there are some statistics out there that suggest that it's the algae on our planet that provide more oxygen than the terrestrial photosynthetic organisms are providing. So there's a lot of algae out there, and it plays a significant role in all of our biomes. Our next marine biome I want to talk about includes coral reefs. And corals are animals that live in the ocean, and they live mutualistically with this algae called zooxanthellae. And it's this algae, the zooxanthellae, that gives the coral these bright colors. And when these coral reefs are being bleached, it's this algae that ends up jumping ship. And because the coral is no longer living mutualistically with the algae, the coral animal suffers as well. Our next marine biome includes marshlands and wetlands. This term refers to the same type of biome. And these are pools of water that occur in areas where there's a depression in Earth's surface. And they can occur either on the coast or inland. So we often find marshlands or marshes at the edges of lakes and streams, and they often are a transition between different ecosystems. There's usually a lot of grasses or reeds, and the amount of water in these biomes can vary throughout seasons. Finally, we have estuaries, which we've talked about before. This is where we have fresh and salt water meeting at the deltas of rivers, so the mouth of the river. And we have the formation of this brackish water, which has low salinity but higher than fresh water. So estuaries are environments that can act as a safe or resting place for fish, or maybe a breeding ground. And they're also environmental filters that allows for the flow of water to kind of slow down. And in the same way, they act as a buffer. So if we have storms coming from the ocean towards inland, the estuaries kind of slow down those storms from progressing further inland quickly. And so finally, I want you guys to add to your notes. I want you guys to do some research. See if you guys can research 3 different events that cause damage to aquatic biome. And I want you guys to reference specific events and write a couple sentences in paragraph form about each event, and also include your source of where you're getting your information. For your notes, you can just reference a website. So make sure you guys are picking reliable sources of information. You can even use your textbook, but reliable sources of information would be websites that have like .org. Try to avoid blogs. If you need help figuring out what a reliable resource is, please contact me. Great job. Have fun doing your research. We'll talk soon.